You wake up and the first decision is already made before you make it. The phone is on the nightstand and your hand reaches for it automatically. Not because you need something. Because you've done this every morning for years. The body doesn't ask permission anymore, it just moves. That's the first sign of something worth looking at closely. Comfort isn't always a couch or a quiet Sunday. It's a pattern. It's the route you take to work, even when another route is faster. It's the playlist you never change. The restaurant you always default to. It's the way you answer, "How are you?" before anyone finishes the question. It's not laziness. It has a different shape from the inside. Laziness feels like not caring. This feels like caring so much that you avoid the risk. The comfort zone is often described as the enemy of growth, which is too simple. It's not a place of rest. It's more like a loop you've reinforced for a long time. Every time you chose the familiar over the uncertain, the loop got stronger. Every time you avoided the conversation, the silence felt more natural than talking. Every time you stayed home instead of going, the preference became a fact about yourself. I'm just not a social person, except you weren't always. You just practiced the exit long enough. The brain doesn't distinguish between a habit that helps and a habit that just feels safe. Both get reinforced the same way. Both become easier to repeat than to question. And this is where the addiction part isn't a metaphor. Neurologically, familiar behavior triggers small, consistent dopamine responses. Not excitement, not joy, just the low hum of, "This is known, this is okay, continue." The unfamiliar triggers something closer to threat response in the nervous system. Your brain does not care whether the unknown thing is dangerous or just different. Uncertainty reads as risk, so the body votes for what it already knows. You don't feel addicted because it doesn't feel like a craving. It feels like preference. It feels like personality, like the things you naturally like versus the things you don't. But preferences can be trained, and avoidance can teach you what you prefer. You avoided conflict enough times that you now prefer peace, even when peace means suppressing. You avoided new social situations enough that you now prefer small circles, even when lonely. You avoided starting the thing enough that you now prefer planning it endlessly. The comfort zone doesn't stay the same size. This is the part people underestimate. It shrinks, quietly, without announcing it. A year ago, you would have taken that call. Now the idea of it feels like too much. A year ago, you would have gone to the party. Now you cancel without needing a reason. The shrinking is gradual enough that it looks like preference, not retreat. You just tell yourself you've gotten more introverted, more selective, more private. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes the zone is just getting smaller and you're calling it maturity. There's a difference between choosing simplicity and accepting contraction as normal. One is a decision, the other is a slow narrowing you've stopped noticing. The most telling moment is when something small, a phone call, a new task, a mild social plan, feels genuinely difficult in a way it didn't 2 years ago. Not hard because it's complex, hard because it's outside the loop. That resistance isn't character, it's the loop protecting itself. Here's what the loop is actually doing beneath the surface. It's managing anxiety before anxiety has a chance to arrive. Not after you try something and it goes badly. Before, preemptively. You decline the invitation not because you tried and felt overwhelmed. You decline because the imagination of discomfort is already uncomfortable enough. The brain learns, avoid early and avoid the discomfort entirely, which works in the short term. You feel relieved the moment you say no. That relief is real, and that relief is exactly what trains the loop to repeat. The comfort zone is sustained by one of the cleanest behavioral feedback loops that exist. Exposure to uncertain situation, anxiety rises, avoidance, relief, repeat. The relief after avoidance feels like calm. The brain files it as, good decision, do again. So you do it again, and the loop tightens one notch. What this means practically is that the zone doesn't protect you from difficulty. It protects you from the feeling of difficulty, which is different. The actual difficulty, the thing you were trying to avoid, often doesn't disappear. The unresolved conversation sits there. The unstarted project stays unstarted. The skill you didn't build leaves the gap. The connection you didn't make stays absent. You avoided the discomfort of doing the thing and inherited the quiet discomfort of not having done it. One is sharp and temporary. The other is dull and persistent. Most people choose the dull and persistent one because it's familiar. There's also an identity layer that doesn't get talked about enough. The comfort zone stops being just a behavioral pattern. It becomes part of who you think you are. When someone suggests you try the thing, the resistance isn't just anxiety. It's something that sounds like, that's not really me. But not really me is often just not what I've practiced recently. The self is more plastic than the comfort zone wants you to believe. It wants you to believe you are a fixed type who has particular preferences and particular limits. Because if you believe that, you stop testing the assumption, and the loop stays intact. You can tell when this is happening because the self-description sounds very settled. I've always been like this. I just don't do well with that kind of thing, said with a kind of finality, not as an observation, as a fact. And facts don't need to be examined. The other thing the loop does is lower your baseline tolerance for discomfort over time. The less you practice sitting with uncertainty, the more intolerable uncertainty becomes. Mild awkwardness starts to feel genuinely distressing. Normal friction, the kind that used to be background noise, starts to feel like too much. The threshold drops. The zone gets smaller. The resistance to anything new gets louder. And at some point, you start avoiding things you used to do easily. Not because you changed. Because your tolerance was gradually untrained. Comfort isn't neutral. It has a cost that accumulates slowly enough to be invisible. You don't notice you've stopped doing things until someone else mentions it, until a photo from 3 years ago shows you somewhere you no longer go, until a friend says, "You used to love this," and you realize you'd forgotten that. The misconception worth correcting here is that breaking out requires a dramatic leap, a big decision, a life overhaul. Quit the job, move to a new city, reinvent completely. That framing keeps most people inside the loop, because dramatic leaps feel unrealistic. And when the only visible exit is unrealistic, staying feels rational. But the loop doesn't break through a leap. It loosens through repetition of smaller friction. The mechanism that built the loop, repeated behavior reinforcing a pattern, runs in reverse too. Small repeated exposure to mild discomfort rebuilds tolerance without requiring a crisis. Not exposure to the thing that terrifies you. Exposure to the thing that's just slightly outside the loop. The conversation you've been avoiding for 3 weeks, not the confrontation of your life. The gym session you've been rescheduling, not the 6-month fitness transformation. The phone call instead of the text. The yes when the default was no. None of these are heroic, that's the point. The brain doesn't need heroism, it needs repetition of a different choice. One uncomfortable choice, followed by noticing you survived it, is a small recalibration. The relief after doing the thing, instead of the relief after avoiding it, retrains the loop. Slowly, not immediately, with setbacks. With nights when you avoid it again. That's not failure. That's how it actually works. The discomfort isn't a signal that you're doing it wrong. It's evidence that you've reached the edge of the current loop, which is exactly where you need to be. What you might also notice as the tolerance rebuilds is that the self-description loosens. "I've always been like this" becomes "I haven't done this in a while." The fixed fact becomes a habit, and habits can change. One thing worth naming before this ends: if the loop has gotten tight enough that daily functioning feels difficult, if what looks like comfort zone avoidance is actually something like persistent anxiety or something heavier, this kind of reflection is a starting point, not a solution. A real conversation with someone trained for this is worth having. This video is for reflection and self-understanding, not professional support. Those are different tools. But for the ordinary shrinking, the gradual narrowing most people experience and don't name, the way back in isn't dramatic. It's the small thing you've been putting off for no real reason. The reply you drafted and didn't send. The class you looked up and didn't book. The conversation you rehearsed in your head 17 times and never had. Not because you can't, because the loop keeps telling you the risk is larger than it is. The loop is not wrong, that discomfort is uncomfortable. It's wrong that discomfort means stop. The zone will try to convince you that its current size is the natural size, that anything beyond it is exposure you weren't built for. But you built the zone through choice and repetition and time, which means a different kind of choice and repetition and time can rebuild it. Slowly, clumsily, with the occasional retreat, which counts as nothing except normal. The question worth sitting with isn't, how do I escape my comfort zone? It's, what have I quietly stopped doing and what has that cost me?